The moment your life begins to change is the moment you stop expecting someone else to carry the weight of it. Sit with that thought for a moment. How much of your life has been spent waiting for the right opportunity, the right motivation, the right person, or the right moment? We convince ourselves that everything will finally fall into place once circumstances improve. Yet the days continue to pass exactly as they always have. The Stoics understood a truth that remains just as relevant today. The only life you can truly shape is the one governed by your own choices. The world has never promised perfect conditions. It has only offered you the freedom to choose your response. And that freedom changes everything. Accepting that truth is uncomfortable because it leaves very little room for excuses. At the same time, it is deeply liberating. The moment you stop negotiating with reality and begin taking responsibility for your own mind, your own actions, and your own character, something begins to shift. Obstacles stop looking like proof that life is against you. They become opportunities to practice resilience, discipline, and sound judgment. Stoicism was never about escaping hardship. It was about becoming the kind of person who remains steady in the middle of it. Strength is not discovered when life becomes easier. It is revealed in the way you meet what life places before you. Perhaps the greatest freedom a person can experience is realizing that lasting strength was never waiting somewhere outside of them. It has been quietly waiting within, shaped by every decision, every habit, and every response to adversity. The life you want is not built through perfect circumstances, but through repeated choices made with clarity and intention. Once that realization takes root, the search for rescue begins to fade. In its place grows something far more powerful, the understanding that the person capable of changing your life has been present all along. Most people assume that the distance between where they are and where they want to be is measured by talent, intelligence, or luck. It is comforting to believe that success belongs to those who were simply given something special, because that explanation protects us from a more demanding truth. If achievement depends entirely on gifts we never received, then we are free from responsibility. We can point to circumstances, compare ourselves with others, and quietly accept that life has dealt us a different hand. Yet the Stoics viewed this way of thinking as one of the greatest obstacles to a meaningful life. They believed that while nature gives each person different circumstances, every individual possesses the same ability to govern their own judgments and choices. That ability is not dramatic, and it rarely attracts attention. It appears in ordinary moments when no one is watching, when a small decision is made either in favor of growth or in favor of comfort. Those moments seem insignificant at the time, but they accumulate with extraordinary force. A life is rarely redirected by one enormous choice. More often, it changes because of countless quiet decisions that gradually shape character. Responsibility is surrendered long before anyone notices the consequences. It happens in ways that feel completely reasonable. A difficult conversation is postponed because the timing does not seem right. A goal is delayed until motivation returns. A promise made to yourself is broken with the explanation that tomorrow will be different. None of these decisions appears serious in isolation, which is exactly why they are so dangerous. The mind becomes accustomed to looking outward for explanations instead of inward for correction. One disappointing experience becomes the fault of circumstances. One missed opportunity becomes the result of bad luck. One failure becomes proof that the world is unfair. Eventually, this pattern settles so deeply that it begins to feel like reality itself. Yet, reality has not changed. Only your relationship with it has. The Stoics often reminded themselves that events are neutral until the mind assigns meaning to them. Two people can encounter the same obstacle and leave with entirely different futures, because one sees only limitation while the other sees an opportunity to practice resilience. There is an understandable temptation to believe that responsibility is heavy. At first glance, it certainly appears that way. Accepting responsibility means letting go of convenient explanations that have provided comfort for years. It requires admitting that some opportunities disappeared, not simply because life was difficult, but because fear quietly influenced decisions that seemed practical at the time. That realization can sting. Pride resists it. The ego immediately searches for evidence that someone else deserves more of the blame. Yet beneath that discomfort lies something surprisingly liberating. Every excuse that disappears returns a small piece of power to your own hands. As Marcus Aurelius wrote, "You have power over your mind, not outside events. Realize this, and you will find strength." If your progress depends entirely on circumstances, then you remain trapped until those circumstances change. But if your response becomes the deciding factor, then progress is possible even in imperfect conditions. This is why Stoicism places such extraordinary importance on self-governance. External events may shape the environment around you, but they do not have the authority to dictate the quality of your character unless you surrender that authority yourself. Consider how often people wait for confidence before taking meaningful action. They imagine confidence as a requirement rather than a consequence. They believe disciplined people must somehow wake each morning already feeling determined, as though consistency were a personality trait instead of a practiced habit. Reality unfolds very differently. Confidence grows because action is repeated despite uncertainty. Discipline develops because choices are honored even when emotions resist them. The Stoics understood that feelings rise and fall like changing weather, but principles remain available every single day. If you anchor your decisions to temporary emotions, your direction changes whenever your mood changes. If you anchor them to values, your path remains steady regardless of the conditions surrounding you. That steadiness is what gradually transforms an ordinary person into someone who appears remarkably resilient from the outside. What others call mental strength is often nothing more than repeated acts of quiet obedience to principles that were chosen long before the difficult moment arrived. This shift does not happen overnight. The mind naturally searches for comfort because comfort conserves energy. It avoids uncertainty, postpones effort, and whispers convincing reasons to remain exactly where it is. That voice can sound remarkably logical. It argues that waiting a little longer is wiser, that beginning tomorrow will produce better results, or that circumstances simply are not favorable enough yet. The danger is not that these thoughts appear irrational. The danger is that they appear sensible. Over time, they become familiar companions, and familiarity often disguises weakness as wisdom. Stoic philosophers warned against accepting every thought simply because it entered the mind. They encouraged examining each judgment carefully before granting it authority. Is this thought leading toward courage or avoidance? Is it strengthening character or protecting comfort? Small moments of honest reflection gradually weaken patterns that once seemed impossible to escape. The mind becomes less reactive and more deliberate, creating space between impulse and action where genuine freedom begins to emerge. As this way of thinking develops, something subtle begins to change. The world itself remains much the same. Challenges still appear without invitation. People still disappoint you. Plans still fail. Uncertainty still exists. Yet your relationship with those realities becomes different because you no longer measure your life by what happens around you. Instead, you begin measuring it by the quality of your response. That distinction may seem small, but it quietly transforms every difficulty into an opportunity for growth. A setback becomes a chance to practice patience. Criticism becomes an opportunity to strengthen humility. Delay becomes an exercise in perseverance rather than a reason to surrender. None of these responses removes hardship, but they prevent hardship from becoming your identity. The Stoics believed that character is revealed not when life becomes easy, but when circumstances refuse to cooperate. Every challenge offers another opportunity to decide who you will become. Perhaps this explains why genuine freedom feels so different from the version most people imagine. Freedom is often mistaken for the absence of difficulty, responsibility, or obligation, yet the deepest freedom emerges when your peace no longer depends on conditions beyond your control. The moment responsibility shifts inward, excuses lose their appeal because they no longer serve a purpose. You stop searching for someone to blame and begin searching for the next wise action. That single habit gradually changes the course of an entire life. Not because every obstacle disappears, but because the person facing those obstacles is no longer the same. The circumstances may remain uncertain, but your direction becomes clear. And once your direction is guided by responsibility instead of excuses, every step forward, no matter how small, becomes evidence that the life you are building has always begun with the choices only you could make. If these reflections resonate with you, and if this is the kind of wisdom you want to carry into your daily life, consider subscribing. Because lasting growth comes from returning to ideas worth remembering. The Stoics believed that character is not built through a single moment of inspiration, but through repeated reflection and steady practice. If responsibility opens the door to freedom, waiting quietly closes it again. Waiting has a remarkable ability to disguise itself as wisdom. It whispers that another week of preparation will make the task easier, that another course will remove uncertainty, or that another sign from the world will finally confirm the right moment. The mind finds comfort in these stories because they protect it from immediate discomfort. Yet every delay teaches the mind something dangerous. It learns that hesitation is safer than action. Over time, that lesson becomes a habit, and habits eventually shape identity. A person who repeatedly postpones meaningful action slowly becomes someone who believes they are simply not ready. The tragedy is not a lack of potential, but a misunderstanding of how growth actually begins. Confidence is often treated like a ticket that must be purchased before stepping into a challenge. Life rarely works that way. Think about the first time someone learned to swim, speak in front of others, start a business, or rebuild life after failure. Confidence did not arrive first and invite action to follow. Action arrived first, awkward and uncertain, and confidence quietly grew behind it. The Stoics recognized this pattern because they understood that courage is not the absence of fear. Courage is choosing the next right action while fear is still present. Every deliberate step weakens uncertainty a little more. Every repeated effort teaches the mind that discomfort can be endured without disaster. Eventually, the thing that once seemed impossible becomes ordinary, not because circumstances changed, but because the person facing them did. Once this becomes clear, something subtle changes inside the mind. Instead of asking when circumstances will become easier, attention shifts toward becoming stronger. That small change in perspective has enormous consequences. Energy that was once spent complaining, comparing, or waiting is redirected toward practice. A difficult conversation is no longer delayed because confidence is missing. It is approached because honesty matters. A meaningful goal is no longer postponed until motivation appears. It is pursued because discipline matters more than passing emotion. The mind gradually stops chasing ideal conditions and begins building reliable habits. That is where quiet transformation begins. There is another reason waiting feels so convincing. It creates the comforting illusion of progress without demanding the sacrifice that genuine progress requires. Planning can feel productive. Thinking can feel productive. Talking about future ambitions can even feel inspiring. None of those things are harmful by themselves, but they become dangerous when they replace action instead of supporting it. The Stoics constantly returned to practice because philosophy meant little unless it changed conduct. Wisdom was never measured by beautiful ideas alone. It was measured by the quality of daily choices. The smallest consistent action carries more weight than the grandest intention that never leaves the imagination. Notice how the strongest people rarely describe themselves as fearless. They simply became familiar with acting before certainty arrived. They discovered that clarity often appears while moving rather than while standing still. This is one of the quiet rewards of disciplined living. Every promise kept to yourself becomes evidence that you can be trusted. Every challenge faced instead of avoided becomes proof that resilience is growing. The mind slowly replaces doubt with earned confidence because it has accumulated real experiences instead of imagined possibilities. That kind of confidence cannot be borrowed from encouraging words or temporary motivation. It is built through repeated encounters with reality. The obstacle never asks whether you feel prepared. It simply appears. You cannot negotiate with it, postpone it forever, or convince it to arrive at a more convenient time. You can only decide who you will become when it stands before you. Every step taken despite uncertainty strengthens something deeper than confidence. It strengthens character, and character becomes the quiet force that keeps moving long after excitement fades. Waiting promises safety, but quietly steals time. Action demands effort, but steadily returns freedom. The path forward has never belonged to those who felt completely ready. It has always belonged to those willing to begin before certainty ever arrived. Each morning offers the same quiet invitation. You either repeat yesterday's postponement or practice a different response. The choice may seem small, yet repeated often enough, it becomes the direction of an entire life. No dramatic breakthrough is required, only the willingness to honor the next responsibility without demanding perfect conditions. Day after day, that simple practice reshapes perception, steadies judgment, reduces needless fear, and reminds you that progress belongs to consistent effort, not endless preparation. Eventually, the habit of beginning becomes stronger than the habit of delaying, and the future once imagined from a distance starts taking shape through ordinary, faithful actions performed today, again and again, without waiting for permission, applause, certainty, or rescue. The most important struggles in life rarely happen where other people can see them. They unfold quietly, often without anyone realizing they are taking place. There is no crowd gathered to witness the moment you decide to keep a promise to yourself after a difficult day. No one applauds when you resist the temptation to abandon a goal simply because progress feels slow. These moments seem too ordinary to matter, and yet they carry extraordinary weight. As Epictetus reminded his students, no great thing is created suddenly. A person's future is not shaped only by the decisions that receive attention. It is shaped by countless private choices that leave no visible trace until much later. The Stoics understood this deeply. They knew that the condition of the mind determined the condition of a life, and the mind is formed in silence long before its strength becomes visible to the world. It is easy to believe that greatness appears suddenly, as though one remarkable achievement changes everything overnight. Reality tells a different story. Every impressive accomplishment has an invisible history that few people ever consider. Behind every confident decision are countless moments of uncertainty that were faced instead of avoided. Behind every disciplined person are hundreds of ordinary mornings when getting out of bed required effort rather than inspiration. Those quiet victories rarely become stories because they seem too small on their own. Yet together, they create the foundation upon which everything else stands. A building does not remain upright because of the beauty people admire on the surface. It stands because of the structure hidden beneath it. Human character develops in much the same way. This is why the Stoics encouraged constant examination of one's own judgments. They understood that every action begins as a thought accepted without question. If the mind is left unguarded, habits form automatically. Some habits strengthen character, while others quietly weaken it. Every decision becomes a vote for the kind of person you are becoming. Choosing patience instead of immediate gratification strengthens patience. Choosing honesty despite discomfort strengthens integrity. Choosing discipline when no external reward exists strengthens self-command. These changes are almost impossible to notice from one day to the next. Like water slowly shaping stone, they work gradually, almost invisibly. Yet given enough time, they transform what once appeared permanent. There is something remarkable about the ordinary moments people often overlook. Consider the decision to close a distracting screen and return to meaningful work. Consider choosing restraint instead of reacting in anger during a frustrating conversation. Consider finishing a commitment even after the excitement that began, it has disappeared. None of these moments would seem impressive if viewed alone. They would barely deserve mention. Yet these are precisely the moments where identity is formed. The person who repeatedly honors small responsibilities eventually becomes someone capable of carrying greater ones. Strength is rarely built during extraordinary challenges alone. It is developed during ordinary days that require quiet consistency rather than dramatic effort. Many people underestimate the influence of repetition because results rarely appear immediately. The first disciplined morning feels no different from the previous one. The first workout changes almost nothing that can be seen. The first difficult conversation resolved with patience may seem insignificant. Because visible progress is delayed, the mind becomes tempted to believe nothing meaningful is happening. This is where many people stop. They mistake invisibility for absence. Yet nature offers a different lesson. Roots grow beneath the surface long before branches reach toward the sky. Foundations are completed before walls begin to rise. The most important stage of development often remains hidden precisely because it prepares everything that follows. Character develops according to the same principle. Over time, these repeated choices begin changing more than behavior. They reshape perception itself. Situations that once appeared overwhelming begin feeling manageable. Challenges that once produced hesitation now invite deliberate action. This does not happen because life becomes easier. It happens because the person encountering those difficulties has quietly become stronger. Confidence starts emerging, not from encouraging words or temporary motivation, but from accumulated evidence. The mind remembers every promise that was kept, every obstacle that was faced, and every impulse that was mastered. Those memories create a different kind of belief, one grounded in experience rather than hope. It is a confidence that remains steady because it has been earned through action instead of imagined through desire. There is also a quiet peace that develops when your attention shifts away from appearances and toward conduct. The need to impress others slowly loses its influence because your greatest standard becomes the one you hold within yourself. Recognition becomes pleasant but unnecessary. Praise becomes welcome but no longer essential. You begin understanding that the quality of your life depends far more on what you repeatedly practice than on what other people happen to notice. The Stoics often reminded themselves that virtue required no audience. A wise action remained wise whether it received applause or silence. That perspective frees the mind from constantly seeking validation and returns its focus to the only place where lasting change has ever begun. Eventually, something extraordinary grows from what once appeared completely ordinary. The habits repeated without excitement become second nature. Discipline no longer feels forced because it has become part of identity. Patience becomes more natural than frustration. Consistency becomes more familiar than procrastination. Looking back, the transformation seems remarkable, yet living through it rarely felt dramatic. It happened one decision at a time, one quiet victory after another, until the person standing in the present bears little resemblance to the one who once believed lasting change was beyond reach. That is how real transformation unfolds. It does not announce itself with sudden fanfare. It accumulates silently, patiently, faithfully. until your daily actions reveal a character that was being built all along. People rarely abandon meaningful pursuits because they are incapable of succeeding. More often, they stop because they misunderstand what the journey is supposed to feel like. Somewhere along the way, many begin believing that steady progress should feel encouraging, that discipline should eventually become effortless, or that the right path should be free from constant resistance. When reality refuses to match those expectations, discouragement quietly takes hold. A difficult week becomes proof that something is wrong. A setback is interpreted as a sign to turn around. Slow progress begins to feel like no progress at all. Yet this misunderstanding has less to do with reality than with the stories we tell ourselves about it. The Stoics viewed hardship through a completely different lens. They did not expect life to remove obstacles for those pursuing worthwhile goals. They expected obstacles to appear precisely because growth demands them. What seems like resistance is often the process itself. The difficulty is not evidence that you have lost your way. It is often confirmation that you are walking a path capable of changing you. The natural world offers a different lesson. Iron is shaped by intense heat before it becomes strong enough for meaningful purpose. A tree standing firmly against powerful winds does not survive because it avoided resistance. It survives because resistance forced its roots to grow deeper into the ground. Rivers carve through solid stone, not by sudden force, but by steady persistence over time. None of these processes appear gentle while they are happening, yet each produces something stronger than what existed before. Human character develops according to similar principles. Patience is not formed during moments when everything unfolds exactly as planned. Courage is not discovered when there is nothing to fear. Discipline is not built on days when every task feels enjoyable. These qualities emerge because life presents situations that demand them. This changes the way setbacks are interpreted. Instead of asking why something difficult has appeared, attention gradually shifts toward asking what this experience is asking you to develop. A delayed opportunity may become an invitation to strengthen patience. A disappointment may reveal expectations that were quietly controlling your peace of mind. Failure may expose habits that success would have allowed to remain hidden. None of these experiences are pleasant in the moment. Stoicism never asks anyone to pretend that pain feels enjoyable. Instead, it invites a different response. Pain can exist without becoming bitterness. Difficulty can exist without becoming defeat. A challenge can remain difficult while still becoming useful. The event itself is only part of the experience. The interpretation that follows determines whether it becomes a burden or a teacher. Gradually, a different relationship with adversity begins to form. Challenges no longer appear as interruptions that steal peace. They become opportunities to practice the very qualities that peaceful lives are built upon. Patience grows because impatience is resisted. Courage grows because fear is faced instead of obeyed. Wisdom grows because every disappointment is examined rather than merely endured. The goal is no longer to eliminate every obstacle, but to become the kind of person who remains steady while moving through them. That steadiness cannot be purchased, borrowed, or inherited. It is earned through repeated encounters with resistance that are met with thoughtful action instead of surrender. Eventually, looking back reveals something surprising. Many of the experiences once viewed as unfortunate become the very moments that shaped lasting strength. The setbacks that seemed unbearable taught resilience. The delays that felt frustrating developed patience. The disappointments that appeared meaningless refined judgment and character. Nothing about those moments was easy, yet none of them were wasted. The obstacle was never simply standing in the way. More often than not, it was quietly becoming part of the way forward. That realization changes everything, because from then on, discomfort no longer signals defeat. It becomes a reminder that growth is still taking place, even when it cannot yet be seen. Eventually, something begins to change in a way that is difficult to notice while it is happening. the world around you remains much the same. There are still delays, disappointments, misunderstandings, and moments when nothing unfolds according to plan. Yet your attention is no longer consumed by asking whether life has treated you fairly. That question slowly loses its grip because it never produces a useful answer. Instead, a different question quietly takes its place. You begin asking whether your response reflects the kind of person you are trying to become. At first, this shift feels small, almost insignificant, but it gradually changes the direction of your entire life. Energy that was once spent judging circumstances is redirected toward refining character. The Stoics understood that this was the beginning of genuine freedom. The world has always been unpredictable, but your conduct within it remains something you can influence every single day. The same transformation begins to affect the way criticism is received. In earlier seasons of life, criticism often feels personal. A single negative comment can occupy the mind for hours or even days. Pride immediately begins constructing arguments, searching for ways to defend itself, or dismissing the opinion entirely. Yet with greater maturity comes a quieter response. Instead of asking whether criticism feels pleasant, you begin asking whether any part of it is useful. As Epictetus wisely observed, "If anyone tells you that a certain person speaks ill of you, do not make excuses about what is said of you, but answer, 'He was ignorant of my other faults, else he would not have mentioned these alone.'" Sometimes another person's judgment is unfair and should be released without resentment. Other times it reveals something that honest self-reflection had overlooked. In either case, your peace no longer depends on controlling what others think. Their opinions become information rather than authority. This subtle distinction protects the mind from becoming emotionally controlled by every passing judgment. As this inner stability develops, solitude also begins taking on a different meaning. Many people experience being alone as evidence that something is missing. Silence becomes uncomfortable because it removes distractions that usually occupy the mind. Without constant entertainment or external validation, unresolved thoughts naturally rise to the surface. At first, this can feel unsettling, yet the Stoics often sought periods of reflection because they understood that the quality of your relationship with yourself determines the quality of every other relationship in your life. Solitude is not empty when it is filled with honest examination. It becomes a place where priorities are clarified, emotions settle, and unnecessary desires gradually lose their influence. Instead of feeling abandoned, you begin feeling acquainted with your own mind in a way that constant noise never allows. This growing sense of clarity changes the way success itself is understood. External achievements still matter, but they are no longer the only measure of progress. A calm response during a frustrating conversation becomes a victory. Remaining disciplined after enthusiasm disappears becomes a victory. Choosing honesty when dishonesty would be easier becomes a victory. These moments rarely receive recognition from anyone else, yet they become deeply satisfying because they align with values rather than appearances. The Stoics believed that the highest good was not wealth, status, or admiration, but excellence of character. That idea feels unfamiliar in a world that often measures worth by visible accomplishments. Yet visible accomplishments can disappear overnight, while character remains with you in every circumstance. Gradually, the desire for constant approval begins losing its influence. This does not mean appreciation becomes meaningless. Encouragement still feels good. Respect still has value. Human beings naturally enjoy being understood. The difference is that approval no longer becomes a requirement for action. You stop delaying important decisions until someone else believes in your vision. You stop measuring your progress by comparison with another person's journey. There is quiet confidence in knowing that the quality of today's effort matters more than today's recognition. That confidence cannot be manufactured through positive thinking alone. It grows from repeated experiences of acting according to principle, even when no one is watching. Every promise kept to yourself becomes another reason to trust your own character. This realization carries both humility and hope. It removes the illusion that life improves simply because external conditions become more favorable. At the same time, it reminds you that meaningful change remains possible regardless of those conditions. Every day presents another opportunity to strengthen patience, sharpen judgment, and practice self-command. None of these qualities appear overnight. They are formed through countless ordinary decisions that rarely seem remarkable while they are happening. Yet those quiet decisions gradually reshape identity. The person who once reacted impulsively learns to pause before responding. The person who once depended on praise learns to continue without it. The person who once feared every setback learns to walk through difficulty with greater steadiness. Looking back, the most remarkable discovery is not that life became easier. It is that your relationship with life became wiser. Circumstances still change without warning. Plans still fail. Uncertainty still exists. But these realities no longer possess the same power to disturb your peace because your foundation no longer rests upon them. It rests upon the habits, principles, and judgments you have patiently cultivated over time. The struggle that once felt like an enemy gradually becomes a teacher. The criticism that once felt unbearable becomes another opportunity to improve. The solitude that once felt empty becomes a place where strength quietly grows. In that quiet transformation, you discover that the greatest victory was never over the world around you. It was over the version of yourself that believed lasting peace could only be found somewhere outside your own character. By this stage, discipline no longer feels like something forced upon you. It no longer resembles a burden that must be carried through sheer determination every single day. Instead, it begins to feel natural, almost like a quiet rhythm that guides your choices without demanding constant debate. This is one of the least understood parts of personal growth. Many people imagine that disciplined individuals wake up every morning overflowing with motivation, eager to tackle every challenge before them. Reality is far less dramatic. The difference is not that they feel inspired more often. The difference is that they have stopped making inspiration a requirement for action. The Stoics understood this long before modern psychology began exploring habits and behavior. They knew that emotions are temporary visitors, arriving without invitation and leaving just as quietly. Building a meaningful life around something so unpredictable is like trying to build a house on shifting sand. A stronger foundation is needed, and that foundation is formed through repeated choices that remain steady regardless of passing emotions. Motivation certainly has its place. It can provide the initial spark that encourages someone to begin. It can fill the mind with excitement about what is possible and create a vision that feels worth pursuing. Yet sparks are not designed to burn forever. They illuminate the beginning, not the entire journey. Too many people mistake that early excitement for lasting commitment. When the emotional intensity naturally fades, they assume something has gone wrong. They believe they have lost their purpose when, in reality, they have simply reached the point where purpose must become practice. This is where habits quietly take over. Habits do not ask whether you feel inspired today. They ask only whether you will continue honoring the promises you have already made to yourself. That consistency appears ordinary from the outside, yet it possesses extraordinary power because it removes the need to negotiate every decision. The mind loves negotiation. It searches for exceptions, justifications, and reasons to postpone effort until tomorrow. It argues that today has been unusually difficult, that conditions will improve later, or that missing one opportunity will not matter. Occasionally, those arguments contain some truth, which is why they are so persuasive. But when every decision becomes another debate, progress slows to a crawl. The Stoics encouraged reducing unnecessary internal conflict by deciding in advance which principles would guide daily life. Once a principle has been chosen wisely, there is less reason to renegotiate it every morning. You do not repeatedly question whether honesty is worthwhile. You simply practice it. The same applies to discipline. Instead of asking whether you feel like acting, you return to the values that already answered the question long ago. There is tremendous freedom in recognizing that feelings are not commands. They are experiences. Some deserve attention, while others deserve observation without obedience. Anger may arise without requiring a harsh response. Fear may appear without demanding retreat. Doubt may visit without determining your identity. The Stoics practiced creating a small space between emotion and action because within that space lies the freedom to choose wisely. Every time you pause before reacting, you strengthen that freedom. Every time you act according to principle instead of impulse, the habit becomes slightly more natural. Over months and years, those seemingly small moments accumulate until responding with wisdom begins to require less effort than reacting without thought. Something equally important begins happening beneath the surface. Confidence gradually changes its source. Early in the journey, confidence often depends on hope. You hope your plans will succeed. You hope your abilities will be enough. You hope circumstances will cooperate. While hope has value, it remains fragile when unsupported by experience. As discipline becomes part of daily life, confidence starts resting on something much stronger. It rests on evidence. You remember the difficult mornings you did not waste. You remember the promises you kept despite discomfort. You remember the setbacks that did not stop you. Those memories become proof that future obstacles can also be faced. Confidence is no longer borrowed from optimistic thinking alone. It is earned through repeated action that demonstrates your ability to continue regardless of changing conditions. This earned confidence creates a quieter kind of strength. It does not need to announce itself or seek validation from others because it has already been tested privately. It is less interested in appearing capable than in continuing to become capable. That distinction changes the way success is pursued. Attention shifts away from dramatic breakthroughs and returns to the simple responsibilities of each day. One meaningful decision follows another. One disciplined action leads naturally to the next. The process stops feeling restrictive because it has become an expression of identity rather than a list of obligations. You are no longer trying to become someone disciplined. You are simply living in a way that reflects who you have patiently become. Looking back, the transformation seems almost surprising because it happened so quietly. There was no single day when fear disappeared forever or when every habit suddenly became effortless. Instead, there were countless ordinary moments when values were chosen over convenience, consistency over impulse, and responsibility over excuses. Those moments gradually shaped a life that no longer depended on emotional highs to keep moving forward. The work continued because the person doing it had changed. That is the quiet strength the Stoics pointed toward. Not perfection, not endless motivation, just the steady practice of choosing what is right often enough that it eventually becomes part of who you are, allowing your confidence to stand firmly upon lived experience instead of uncertain expectation. Perhaps the most powerful truth a person can encounter is also one of the most uncomfortable. Nobody is coming. At first, those words can feel cold, almost discouraging, because they strip away every comforting illusion the mind has quietly relied upon for years. They leave no room for fantasies about the perfect mentor appearing at the perfect time, the ideal opportunity arriving without effort, or life suddenly becoming easier because circumstances finally decided to cooperate. The initial reaction is often resistance. Part of the mind wants to argue against it, to insist that someone will eventually provide the answer, the motivation, or the breakthrough that changes everything. Yet, as Seneca wrote, we suffer more often in imagination than in reality. As time passes, something unexpected begins to happen. The very truth that once sounded harsh begins to feel freeing. If no one is coming to rescue you, then your future is no longer tied to someone else's choices. It is no longer waiting for another person's approval, another person's belief, or another person's permission. It quietly returns to where it has always belonged, in your own hands. That realization changes the way every ordinary day is experienced. Suddenly, small decisions carry greater significance because they are no longer seen as isolated moments. They become the building blocks of an entire life. Choosing to begin instead of postpone matters. Choosing patience instead of frustration matters. Choosing discipline instead of convenience matters. These decisions rarely appear dramatic while they are being made, yet they quietly determine the direction your future will take. Many people spend years searching for a single event that will transform everything overnight, while overlooking the hundreds of quiet moments that have been shaping them all along. The Stoics understood that life is rarely altered by one extraordinary action. More often it is redirected by ordinary choices, repeated with extraordinary consistency. Every habit practiced today becomes easier tomorrow, and every promise kept to yourself strengthens the ability to keep the next one. This is why the Stoics placed such importance on the present moment. They understood that the mind often becomes trapped between regret for yesterday and anxiety about tomorrow, leaving very little attention available for today. Yet today is the only place where choices can actually be made. Yesterday can instruct you, but it cannot be changed. Tomorrow can inspire you, but it cannot yet be lived. The only responsibility you truly possess exists within the present moment. That is where discipline is practiced. That is where habits are strengthened. That is where courage quietly replaces hesitation. The future is not created somewhere in the distance. It is assembled piece by piece through the decisions made while standing exactly where you are. As this understanding grows, another subtle change begins taking place. The need to control every outcome gradually loses its grip. You begin focusing less on guaranteeing success and more on becoming the kind of person capable of meeting whatever success or failure may bring. This is a profound shift because it removes much of the unnecessary fear surrounding action. If your worth depends entirely upon achieving a specific result, every setback feels threatening. But if your purpose is to strengthen character through faithful effort, then every experience contains value regardless of the outcome. Victory teaches gratitude. Defeat teaches resilience. Delay teaches patience. Difficulty teaches endurance. Nothing becomes entirely wasted because everything becomes an opportunity to practice the qualities that remain within your control. Eventually, looking back reveals that the phrase once feared had been pointing toward freedom all along. "Nobody is coming" was never a message of hopelessness. It was an invitation to reclaim ownership of a life that had too often been placed in the hands of circumstances. It reminded you that meaningful change begins long before anyone else notices it. It begins with one decision made honestly, then another after that. Those decisions become habits, habits become character, and character quietly shapes destiny. The Stoics believed that a well-lived life is not measured by how much control a person gains over the world, but by how faithfully they govern themselves within it. Time will continue moving, whether you hesitate or act. Life has already begun unfolding. The only question that truly remains is whether each new day will be met with the same familiar excuses, or with the quiet determination of someone who has finally accepted complete responsibility for becoming the author of their own life. The desire to be understood is natural. Every person wants to feel seen, appreciated, and accepted. There is nothing inherently wrong with enjoying encouragement or valuing healthy relationships. The difficulty begins when approval quietly changes from something pleasant into something necessary. Without realizing it, many people begin organizing their decisions around how they will be perceived, instead of whether those decisions reflect their deepest values. They choose careers to impress rather than to contribute. They remain silent to avoid rejection instead of speaking honestly. They abandon meaningful goals because progress is not immediately recognized. Little by little, life becomes a performance rather than an expression of character. The audience changes, but the performance continues. Eventually, it becomes difficult to distinguish between who you truly are and who you have learned to appear to be. As this understanding grows, your relationship with criticism also begins to change. Negative opinions no longer feel like personal attacks that threaten your identity. Instead, they become something to examine calmly. If criticism contains truth, it becomes an opportunity to improve. If it contains only misunderstanding, it can be released without bitterness. The mind no longer reacts immediately because it has learned to separate another person's judgment from its own sense of worth. This does not mean becoming indifferent or arrogant. It means refusing to hand emotional control to every passing voice. The Stoics believed that wisdom required careful examination before accepting any impression as true. The same principle applies here. Not every opinion deserves a permanent place in your thinking simply because someone expressed it with confidence. This growing independence creates an unexpected sense of peace. Energy that was once spent trying to satisfy everyone gradually returns to more meaningful pursuits. Instead of constantly wondering how you appear, attention shifts toward how you live. Instead of chasing admiration, you focus on cultivating honesty, discipline, patience, and courage. These qualities cannot always be measured by public recognition, but they become evident in the quiet consistency of everyday life. Ironically, people who stop seeking approval often become more authentic, and authenticity carries a quiet influence that performance never achieves. They speak more honestly because they are less afraid of disagreement. They act more consistently because they are no longer adjusting their values to match changing expectations. Over time, confidence begins resting on a stronger foundation. It no longer depends upon applause because applause is unpredictable. It no longer depends upon popularity because popularity changes with the opinions of the moment. Instead, confidence grows from repeated evidence that you can trust your own conduct. Every difficult choice made with integrity strengthens that trust. Every temptation resisted reinforces it. Every action aligned with your principles becomes another reminder that your character is something you actively shape rather than something other people define. This kind of confidence is quiet. It does not need constant validation because it has already been tested in private moments where no audience existed. Eventually, you realize that freedom was never found in convincing everyone to understand you. Such a goal was impossible from the beginning because every person sees the world through different experiences, expectations, and beliefs. Real freedom comes from understanding yourself clearly enough that misunderstanding no longer distracts you from your purpose. You stop performing for spectators and begin living according to convictions that remain steady whether they receive praise or silence. The world continues offering opinions, as it always will, but those opinions lose the power to decide your direction. Your attention returns to the only place where lasting stability has ever been built: the quality of your own thoughts, the consistency of your own actions, and the quiet discipline of becoming the kind of person whose peace cannot be borrowed from anyone else's approval. From that point onward, responsibility begins to feel very different from the way it once did. It is no longer experienced as a heavy obligation resting on your shoulders or a constant reminder that life is difficult. Instead, it becomes the quiet structure supporting everything you do. The mind stops arguing with every necessary action because it has already accepted that meaningful growth requires consistent effort. What once felt restrictive now feels stabilizing. The habits that seemed demanding gradually become familiar, and the discipline that once required enormous effort begins operating almost unnoticed. This is one of the quiet rewards of living with intention. You stop asking yourself every morning whether you feel ready, because readiness is no longer the condition for action. Action itself becomes part of who you are. The Stoics believed that freedom was never found in escaping responsibility, but in embracing it so completely that it became an expression of character rather than an external burden. This transformation rarely happens through one dramatic decision. It unfolds through repetition. Every ordinary day offers another opportunity to strengthen the same qualities that slowly reshape the mind. Patience grows every time frustration is resisted. Self-control becomes stronger each time an impulse is observed without being obeyed. Humility develops each time pride is replaced with honest reflection. None of these moments appears extraordinary while they are happening. They often feel almost invisible. Yet these quiet choices accumulate with remarkable consistency. The person who repeatedly chooses wisdom over convenience eventually stops seeing those choices as sacrifices. They simply become the natural response. What once required determination becomes habit, and habit gradually becomes identity. This is how philosophy leaves the pages of a book and enters the rhythm of everyday life. There is a noticeable difference between living according to emotions and living according to principles. Emotions are valuable because they reveal what is happening within us, but they are constantly changing. They rise with success and fall with disappointment. They shift with circumstances, weather, fatigue, and countless influences beyond conscious control. If every important decision depends on how you happen to feel, your direction changes as often as your emotions do. Principles offer something far steadier. They remain available on difficult mornings just as they do on joyful ones. They remind you of the person you have decided to become long after temporary excitement has faded. The Stoics understood this well. They trained themselves to return repeatedly to what was right, rather than what was comfortable. That simple habit created remarkable consistency because their choices were anchored in values instead of moods. This perspective also changes the way obstacles are received. Instead of viewing unexpected difficulties as interruptions, they become opportunities to practice everything you have been trying to cultivate. Patience is no longer an abstract idea discussed during peaceful moments. It becomes something exercised while plans fall apart. Courage is no longer admired only in stories about remarkable people. It appears whenever uncertainty is faced without retreat. As Marcus Aurelius wrote, "The impediment to action advances action. What stands in the way becomes the way." Self-control becomes visible not when life is easy, but when emotions invite reactions that wisdom refuses to follow. Every circumstance becomes another chance to strengthen the qualities that cannot be developed in comfort alone. The world itself does not become less demanding, but your relationship with its demands becomes calmer because each experience now serves a meaningful purpose. Over time, the destination also begins to occupy a different place in your thinking. Goals still provide direction, but they stop carrying the impossible responsibility of determining your happiness. You begin understanding that reaching one milestone will simply reveal another beyond it. If fulfillment depends entirely on arrival, peace remains permanently delayed. The Stoics encouraged appreciating the journey because the journey is where character is actually formed. Every thoughtful decision, every disciplined habit, every moment of restraint contributes something lasting, regardless of how quickly external success appears. Progress becomes less about racing toward an imagined future and more about becoming someone worthy of whatever future eventually arrives. That subtle shift removes much of the anxiety surrounding achievement because your greatest work is taking place long before the final result becomes visible. Looking back, you realize the greatest change was never merely in your circumstances. It happened quietly within your perspective. Responsibility stopped feeling like a weight because it became the foundation beneath every meaningful choice. Discipline stopped feeling restrictive because it created freedom from indecision and impulse. Progress stopped depending entirely on visible achievements, because every day offered another opportunity to strengthen the mind guiding those achievements. The process itself became deeply worthwhile. Success and adversity continued arriving, just as they always had, but neither possessed the power to define you anymore. What defined you was the consistency with which you met them. And from that place of quiet steadiness, life no longer waited to begin. It was already unfolding through every thoughtful action, every deliberate habit, and every moment you accepted that the life you hoped to build had always been yours to shape. The life you want has never been waiting somewhere in the future. It has been quietly taking shape through every decision you make today. Every moment you choose discipline over comfort, responsibility over excuses, and wisdom over impulse, you become the person you once hoped to be. That is the quiet power the Stoics understood. True victory is not found in controlling the world, but in mastering yourself within it. Thank you for being part of Stoic Journal and for choosing to invest your time in becoming stronger, wiser, and more resilient. If this message resonated with you, continue the journey by watching one of the videos on your screen now. Until next time, take care of your mind, guard your character, and keep moving forward.